And that's where history comes in. As a few historians have pointed out, if the shroud is to be connected to Jesus, it's got to be done historically. No scientific tests say, aha, we found Jesus Christ.
Well, all rise, ladies and gentlemen. It's Abdi Murray, your host for All Rise. This is a podcast and a YouTube video channel where we examine claims against and claims for the Christian faith from a legal perspective. We take a look at the rules of evidence, rules of trial procedure, the way juries are instructed, the way judges think, and the way rulings are made, and ask ourselves, are the claims against the Christian faith the kind of claims that would withstand that kind of scrutiny? Or are the claims in favor of the Christian faith the kinds of claims that would stand against that kind of scrutiny? I'm your host, Abdi Murray, and as a trial lawyer, I have become familiar with the rules of evidence. I understand exactly the way in which evidence is introduced. And so we try to take a look at a particular facet of the Christian faith, whether it's an objection against it or a claim in favor of it, and apply a certain rule of evidence or some kind of rule of procedure to that particular claim. And so today, what I wanted to talk about, and I have a special guest with me, by the way, and I'll get to our special guest in just a moment. He's an expert witness, as it were. And that's part of the hook today. Part of the legal hook is that we have an expert witness joining us on the podcast. And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and that's what you are. You are the jury. You're the ones who make the decisions. We present the case and you make the decisions. So if you're a Christian, you're a part of the jury. If you're not a Christian, you're a part of the jury. And we'll see at the end where we are as the defense actually rests. Well, expert testimony is part of the hook we have for today. But I also wanted to talk about something else that's a fundamental and important distinction in the law of certain kinds of evidence. So when we have a court case, we have certain kinds of evidence that would be considered broken down into two categories. The first category is testimonial evidence. And that's basically what it sounds like. It's evidence that's testimony, someone's eyewitness testimony or recollection of something that happened, or if they were there, or what the document actually says. Other times, documents can be part of the testimonial evidence as well. It's not just people talking, it's actually documents that can talk, and they're presented. So that's one area of evidence. Another area of evidence is what's called real evidence. And real evidence doesn't mean the other evidence is fake. What it means is real in terms of tangible or the kind of thing you can grasp a hold of. So don't let the term real fool you into thinking that the other evidence isn't real. In fact, that evidence can be as real, even more real than so-called tangible evidence. But so we have testimonial evidence, which is great, and we have real evidence, which is different. And real evidence is further broken down into different kinds of evidence as well. And that evidence would be things like actual artifacts or documents, or usually just some kind of an artifact. But also there's scientific evidence, which can be considered real evidence as well. So we're going to talk about real evidence in this one. Before we get to today's episode of All Rise, I want to remind you to join me and Derek Caldwell for deliberations on the Tuesday following the airing of All Rise for a live stream where you get to ask us questions about the previous episodes of All Rise. So it's a live event. We want you to interact with us. You can find out about the live event in several ways. One, subscribe to this YouTube channel and click the bell so you can get the notifications of when we go live. So either submit your questions through the comment section of this YouTube page, or if you're listening on podcast, send us a question to mail, M-A-I-L, at embracethetruth.org, and we might address it live with you. Or you can also join us on our various social media channels. And if you like our social media channels or you're following me there, you'll get notified that we're going to go live. So the following Tuesday, we'll have deliberations when we'll be talking about previous episodes of All Rise. We're hoping to join you live. And we're going to have some testimony, so some testimonial evidence about it as well, from an expert witness who is my delight and pleasure to introduce to you. And that expert witness is Dr. Gary Habermas. He's a good friend and someone whose work has benefited me greatly. In fact, I've told Gary this before, but even before I became a Christian, when I was very, very much an opponent of the historical resurrection, Gary's work, along with Mike Lacona and other folks as well, really helped me to get through and think through whether or not this actually happened. Because when I was a Muslim, I doubted this actually happened. In fact, I doubted that Jesus even died on a cross at all. And the evidence that I learned from Dr. Habermas and from others really helped me along the way. Now, of course, in one sense that you might say, well, you're presenting a witness who you're biased towards. And the answer is, I like Gary. He's a good man. He often will bear hug me whenever I don't see him coming at conferences. However, that does nothing to take away from the fact that he's got a long list of accomplishments. He is the Distinguished Research Professor of Apologetics at Liberty University. You can find out more about Gary at GaryHabermas.com. That's GaryHabermas.com. Or just look up that same name on YouTube and you'll get a bevy of videos that you can see some wonderful evidence presented and some wonderful arguments in favor of the Christian faith as well. Gary is an expert in history, and he's got his degrees in philosophy as well. But his premier work is on the resurrection of Jesus. So, Gary, welcome to the program. It's great to have you on.
Thank you, Abdu. Good to be here with you and good to discuss this from an evidential viewpoint. I love the setup because that's exactly the kind of evidence I at least fancy that I'm dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and this particular evidence, you're well known for your evidence on the historical, the resurrection, and a lot of the testimonial evidence I talked about before, which forms a lot of the backbone of the case, which is solid stuff, but it forms a solid backbone for the case for the resurrection of Jesus as a historical matter. What I wanted to talk with you about today, we're going to go into a little bit of your bona fides. I need to lay my foundation as a good lawyer. I need to basically voir dire the witness, as it were, to assess your qualifications to talk about this. But the topic we're going to talk about today is real evidence, specifically taking a look at the authenticity or the controversy around the Shroud of Turin. And I'll ask you in a moment to discuss what the Shroud actually is. But it's an exciting piece of artifact history because it pertains particularly to the resurrection of Jesus. So before we get into that, Gary, let's talk a little bit about your bona fides. You're a PhD from Michigan State University, which I won't hold against you because my son is now a Spartan. But go ahead and give us a little bit of your educational background.
Well, it mentioned being in Michigan State. I was there for my PhD, and my dissertation was on the subject of the resurrection. Today, we tend to have committees, PhD committees, that are maybe 3 people. But at Michigan State, for some crazy reason, I had 6 people on my committee. And as near as I can tell, they were evenly divided between 3 folks who thought I was arguing truth and 3 folks who thought I was arguing error. So 3 of the members, it wasn't just guys saying, "Oh yeah, you're a good guy, we're going to give you a degree." 3 of these guys didn't. I had an agnostic on my committee. I had a Jewish professor of history on my committee, non-Christian Jewish professor, very complimentary. He was probably the most complimentary person on my dissertation. And so, well, this is Abdu, I just remembered, this is an incredible way to start. When he read my dissertation and handed it back to me, and we're getting ready for the oral defense, he said, "Hey, you've got a lot of evidence here for the resurrection, but I think you've left out the number 1 evidence." And I said, "Oh, for crying out loud, what do you think? What in the world do you think I left out?" And he said, "You didn't say a word about the Shroud of Turin."
Oh, wow. Wow, that's interesting. That's fascinating.
So, yeah. And he's an historian. So people say things like, "Oh, Shroud of Turin, that's dirty thumbnail apologetics. You're not really doing the real thing here. You're just kind of getting into the dirt of apologetics." And here this professor, non-Christian history professor, thought it was the best evidence for the resurrection. So
That's great.
that was amusing to
That's
me.
great. That's great. Well,
But further, when I finished my dissertation, I called a person on the phone. I tried to get a phone number, and I was successful getting it. And I called one of the 2 names on the Shroud team. I did my dissertation in 1976. They were getting ready to test the Shroud in 1978. And I called this fellow on the phone, a professor from the Air Force Academy, and I started asking questions. And he said, "Excuse me, but I can't answer any of your questions. We've all we've all signed a long 3-page run-on legalese sentence, binding us all to non-disclosure until the data on the shroud are released in October if I remember correctly, 1981. And so he said, "So I'm not going to talk to you. You sound like a uh, you sound like a reporter." And I said, "Well, I'm not a reporter." He said, "Well, you still sound like one." And I said, "That's great." I said, "I just finished my PhD. I did it on the resurrection, and I'm interested in learning whether there's any evidence on the shroud." And he said, "Well, I can't talk to you, but I'll hook you up with our editor and spokesperson on the team." And he gave me the number of one Ken Stevenson, who was another Air Force professor at the academy. And that night, I called Ken on the phone, and we became lifelong friends. And that first phone call went about 3 hours. And at the end of the phone call, believe it or not, Ken said to me, he said, "Gary, you're doing a book on the shroud, right?" "Yep." "You just did your session on the resurrection, right?" "Yep." "Hey, what do you say we do the shroud book together?" I thought, well, this is pretty incredible, Ken. You were in the investigation. You were in Turin. You saw all the photographs being taken. I don't know why you'd want to do it with me, but if that's what you want to do, let's do it. And in 1981, we brought out the first book, Verdict on the Shroud. And then 9 years later, we brought out a second book together called The Shroud and the Controversy. And that's because that second book came out 2 years after the 88 Carbon 14, which supposedly put a nail in the Shroud's coffin, and just recently, in the last 2 years, has been blown out of the water by some scientific data. The dating has been blown out of the water. But in 1988, that was all the news. And we tried to say in 1990 what can still be said about the Shroud in light of this dating. So that was my beginning. I worked on 2 books with Ken, and he was the editor and spokesman for the team of scientists who did the investigation in 19. He did the investigation in Turin in 1978.
That's great. Well, so that actually helps with quite a bit of the background, because one of the things that an expert witness has to have is actually some level of not only just inquiry about something, and you don't have to be directly involved in like the experimentation or the whatever, but some level of, and it sounds like quite a bit of level of actual direct involvement with some of the research and some of the conclusions and some of the investigation on the shroud. So here's what I want to do. I want to switch really quickly, because some of our listeners and viewers, because this is also, not only is this a podcast on audio everywhere you can find podcasts, but it's also a YouTube channel. So you go ahead and if you're listening on audio, check it out on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/AbdiMurrayOfficial. I'm sure this will be available at some point on Gary's websites as well. But what I want to do is back up and ask this question: what is the shroud? Let's tell our audience, what is the Shroud of Turin? Why is it called the Shroud of Turin? And just what is the artifact itself? And then we'll get into some more of the particulars.
Easiest question first. It's called the Shroud of Turin because its modern history. In its modern history, it's been located, a little bit in France and so on, and moved during World War II so it wouldn't be destroyed. But its home has been in Turin, Italy, in northwestern Italy.
Okay.
So when pilgrims go to see this in person, that's where they would travel, to the city of Turin. The shroud itself is about 14 feet 3 inches long, and it's about a little over 3.5 feet wide. And it wrapped around head to toe, and then toe back to the back of the head. It goes all the way around the body. And so I'll illustrate it like this. If you have a human body, the cloth wraps it, and at the head, let's say is my palms here, the body would fall out, and the cloth totally opens up to 14 feet. Now, because the 2 heads, quote unquote, front of the head, back of the head, there's a little gap in between. But because they're together, the feet are at the opposite ends of the cloth. And on one end is the top of the feet, on the other end is the bottom of the feet. So it was a cloth that was laid that way around a person. Now, a couple thoughts about that kind of burial. A lot of people say, well, right away, then it's a fake because that's not the way Jews buried. Well, I mean, that's just way too brief a critique for more than one reason. Number one, Jewish in cemeteries, people have been buried like that. And there's even been a case or two where they've been discovered. You know, they're not wrapped like a mummy. First of all, that's Egypt. That's not Israel. And secondly, these people in the graves had their elbows out on the side and their hands down in front, just like the picture of the man in the shroud. If you're wrapped like a mummy, you don't have your elbows out the side. And but secondly, this is very important. The women were coming Sunday morning, apparently to finish the process. They were coming with spices to finish the process. So, what happened on presumably Friday afternoon, the most popular day for the crucifixion? What happened was a very hasty burial because the book of Deuteronomy says, "Cursed is the man who hangs on a tree." They had to get him down and in the grave by sundown.
Because Sabbath.
And then the Sabbath
Yeah.
starts. So that all had to be done. So it was a very hasty burial. So my first response is, yes, there are some people who are buried that way in Israel. But my second response is, it doesn't make any difference because what happened on Friday afternoon was apparently not the finished product.
Okay.
As far as the burial is concerned.
I'm going to pause real quick because what I want to show our viewers is a image of the actual, for the YouTube, an image of the actual shroud. So there's two popular images. One is a brownish image, which is a photo of the actual shroud, but then there's like a photo negative looking image, and we'll get to that in a minute because that's important. So let's just show the audience right now what the shroud looks like when you're looking at it with your naked eye, as it were. So ladies and gentlemen, if you're listening on the podcast, the audio version, you'll want to go check out the YouTube channel at youtube.com/AbduMurrayOfficial so you can see an image of the shroud and see what we're talking about here, because this is a highly visual part of our episode of the podcast, as it were. So this is what it looks like. So continue, Gary, because there's a lot. So the shroud basically is the burial cloth for a crucified person. That's what it purports to be. But why is it significant to the Christian faith? Because you've already alluded to it.
Yes.
as related to Jesus' crucifixion. So what about the shroud is related specifically to Jesus, or at least purported to be?
Great question. And that's where history comes in. As a few historians have pointed out, if the shroud is to be connected to Jesus, it's got to be done historically. No scientific tests say, aha, we found Jesus Christ. I mean, science just doesn't do that. Mm-hmm. And so you have to go to history. And here's the historical argument that there's a good chance that this is Jesus. The man in the shroud is crucified, and he's crucified with the marks that are associated in the Gospels and elsewhere, Christian art, with Jesus. But there are some surprises, some things that if somebody were trying to fake it, they would never have done it this way. Here's a few examples. The man in the shroud he's had something pressed into his scalp, and it's not a little thin wreathlet like a king would wear, but it's been described more as a skull cap that comes over everything. And he's cut throughout his hair with a series of sharp objects pressed into his scalp that are not the whipping wounds. Now, there are dozens and dozens of whipping wounds. The marks on the head are different kinds of marks. Okay, so first of all, you'd say, well, we pictured Jesus having a wreathlet. And they'd say, well, in the shroud, it's more like a skull cap. If you're trying to sell this image in the Middle Ages, if you're trying to sell it, it's an image of Jesus, you've got to make it look like the Gospels. So one way right off the bat is, what's the difference of these, whatever they are, that are pressing into a scalp? A much larger problem is that one art historian says he's never seen a piece of medieval art where Jesus was not nailed in the palms of the hands. But the man in the shroud is nailed through the wrists. At the very least, you'd say the nail might go here at the very bottom, but the exit point you see the wrist from the back because the hands are crossed, and the exit point is right about there. So it looks like he's nailed through the wrist. Then somebody says, well, then not only is it not Jesus, it's not biblical because Jesus showed them his hands and his feet. Well, here's an argument where the Greek, unlike most Greek, it's not as specific as we might think. It's much more general. And the word for hand in Greek is a very general term, comparatively speaking, and it can mean hand, it can mean lower arm. In fact, one time I was told there's a reference where the word hand is used and it's the middle arm. So to say he's nailed through the hand doesn't answer the question. You got to know where it goes. So what about the hands that are in the wrist? The man in the shroud may or may not be nude underneath the cloth. Well, you would never depict Jesus nude. Uh, you know, that's sacrilegious. So things like the thorns, especially the nails coming out of the wrist, is a real no-no. If you're trying to convince people this is Jesus, make it look like Jesus. And the wounds are really, really closely aligned. For example, he's been stabbed in his right upper chest, and the cut mark is about just short of 2 inches long, and a bloody and watery serum comes out from the chest wound down to the waist. And then when they rolled him over, to bury him and carry him and such, it flowed along his waist in the back. And the chief pathologist said, you can see this watery fluid in the blood flow in the back easier than you can see in the front.
I just want to pause just for a second because I just want to make sure
Sorry?
we establish something really important here is what you've been talking about is not, in terms of the imagery, is not what the Gospels say. It's what the Shroud depicts, and that's consistent with those things. But you're talking about what the Shroud actually shows, like the blood and the serum and the stab wounds and the things through the wrists, right?
Right.
And then the pathologist was a pathologist who was studying the Shroud itself.
Well, pathologist is, they do a lot of jobs, but a pathologist would be one of the people in a morgue who determines the cause of death in what might be a legal case later. Was this a natural death or was this a murder? Pathologists are experts in causes of death and whether the individual was dead and so on.
Great. Okay, so there's more. I interrupted you. You had more to say.
Yeah, I was going to say, if your child goes to school and comes home one day and says, I have to do a report on the crucifixion of Jesus, I would say to them, don't use the Gospels as an example, because what happened to Jesus was not a normal crucifixion. It's true that crucifixion victims were almost always beaten ahead of time. But in Jesus' case, why beat a person? It's counterproductive to beat a person within an inch of their life, as the saying says, and then expect them to carry the crossbeam up the hill and then be crucified. The cross is supposed to be the eventual end, not the whipping. But this man's been whipped very seriously. Now the shroud's been in a couple fires, so you have to count how many beating marks there would be underneath the burnt areas based on how many whippings per square inch are available in the part we can see. And there are a lot of estimates. Plus, you have to divide by the number of tongs, so to speak, on the end of a whip. It's often thought that these are patterns of 3. So there may have been 3 sets of barbs on the end of the rawhide straps. And but he's got hundreds of beating marks on his body. So why kill a guy almost to death? Here's another one. Criminals. Who gets killed? Criminals, people guilty of sedition, people rebelling against the government, Benedict Arnold, so to speak. But because of that, their bodies are often thrown into the garbage pit in Jerusalem, where a lot of always stinks, and there's things thrown in there that the fire will take care of it, and that'll be the end of it. Well, Jesus is buried in a very rich setting. He's buried in a tomb with expensive linen. So what the Gospels say is what happens to the man of the shroud. But what happened to the man of the shroud is not normal crucifixion. So here's the point. If it's not crucifixion, but it happened to both of them, is that a pointer that the man of the shroud is Jesus? And you'd say, well, here's an alternate theory. Maybe they crucified some poor soul to look like Jesus, because after all, they want to sell this thing as being Jesus' crucifixion, make a lot of money. So you crucify some guy and get an image on him, and then you can go peddle it and make money. The problem with the natural thesis that they crucified somebody the express way the Gospels say so is that then you can't explain about probably the top 6 anomalies on the shroud are unexplainable by that example. Like, why would you have an image on a cloth when there are hundreds of burial garments in existence and none of them have body images?
Yeah. So this is the fascinating part of this discussion I want to get to, because I think what you've established is what the shroud depicts, and so therefore it's connected to Jesus because the shroud depicts the burial of a crucified man who looks very much like we would expect Jesus to look, with some slight anomalies like the skull cap being different than the sort of wreathlet that we assume the crown of thorns looked like. However, because you said something else to make sure it's clear, is that if a child was saying I had to do a book report on the crucifixion of Jesus, I wouldn't use the Gospels. Did you mean if a child was doing a book report on first century crucifixion, you wouldn't use the Gospels because the Gospels depict an unusual one, right?
Correct.
Okay. Yep. So
correct.
Let's get to the
better said. That's correct.
So let's get to the anomalies, because this is the part where, the debate, the controversy right now is how old is this thing? Because the image or the cloth itself or the image on the cloth would have to be first century to be Jesus' burial shroud. But there are those who say, no, this is a 13th century, 14th century forgery that's made to look like it, as you alluded to earlier. So you could, basically shill and spend some money, get some money off of this thing, claiming it's authentic, but it's not. Your contention right now is that there are some indications, or there are actually some actual verifiable anomalies on the shroud, which would sort of respond to that. So give us some of those anomalies. What are the anomalies on the shroud that would suggest that this is not a forgery of the 13th, 14th century?
Sure. Well, let's start with some of the basics. There are hundreds of burial garments in existence from way back in history. I mean, just a moment's thought. Mummy cloths predate Jesus. So we have cloth going way back. And while you can find burial cloths with blood stains and decomposition stains, you don't find burial cloths. You don't open them up and go, oh my gosh, there's a body image on this. You don't find body images. All right, so that's one starting point. Okay, then what about the body image? There are several very important anomalies. The image on the shroud is non-directional. Now, in one of our 2 books on the shroud, Ken Stevenson and I have a photograph of non-directionality. And when you look at it, it doesn't look like much. It looks like someone took the shade off of their favorite lamp in the living room and photographed the light coming out in all directions at once from the light bulb. That's non-directionality. Whatever created the image on the shroud didn't go left, right, left, right, left, right. Then the person gets tired coloring or painting. They go up and down, up and down, up and down. It happened like taking that lampshade off and having it look like, boom, it's on the cloth at once. That's a real oddity. Now, I'm going to move up the list of the very difficult things to explain. Non-directionality is a little bit of an issue. There are bigger issues. Another one is the shroud image is superficial. That means if you take a thread, think about a thread and how wide it is. Well, it's not wide. If you cut it, can you see the side of it? Yeah, probably not. But what goes into a thread? Well, in a thread on the shroud, there could be 200 fibrils that make up that thread. But when the image came on the cloth, it is on the top fibril, basically. It's on the top fibril. It doesn't turn turn it over, and there's no image on the back. No image on the back of the thread. So whatever created the image is superficial. It had to be on the top. So that means, besides just the empirical fact that there's no paint, dye, powder, or any foreign substance on the shroud that could create the image, the problem is all those applications, physically speaking, in physics, it would sink down into the cloth. You're either going to have a contact image like blood. The blood on the shroud is a contact image. It was up against the blood of the man in the shroud, and it soaked through the cloth. But the image area sets on the top fibrils of each thread. That's very difficult to explain in physical terms. Number three, we're moving up, is up until recently, this is the most important, the hardest thing to explain. Shroud image is three-dimensional. Now, we talk about three-dimensional photography today, but I understand it's not really what it is. But when the Air Force Academy fellows, my co-author Ken Stevenson was in a carpool with three of the best-known shroud researchers. They had a computer at that time. It was called a VP8 image analyzer, and it analyzed Voyager type space shots to the surface of the whatever, Mercury, Mars. It would measure distance, and distance is encoded in the photographs. And so when they put other photographs through, they were ugly. I mean, the nose sunk into the face, the eyes bulged out. They were not to scale. But when they put the image, the shroud face photograph into the VP8 analyzer, there's a lot of famous photos out there where you could immediately see the contours of this person's face. And 3D, you go, okay, well, that's crazy, but what does it mean? Well, it means that whatever left the mark on the cloth had to go across distance that was not of a few centimeters, that were not touching the body. So if the man's lying on his back and his hands are crossed in front of him, and the left knee, by the way, has popped back up in a state of rigor mortis. The body's in a state of rigor mortis. I tell people it's kind of hard to fake. Say I'm not dead. I'm just standing here real stiff. The left knee popped back up. So here's some examples. The cloth would touch the forehead and the chin, but not the cheeks and the ears. The cloth would touch the chest, but not the rib cage. And here's the big one. The shroud would drape over the left knee, which was raised, but not the right knee, which was down flat. And yet, we have the equal image represented so equally. Now, here's a math problem for you. If a man who weighs about 180 pounds, which is about how heavy the man was in the shroud, about 5'10", 180 pounds, if he's lying on a cloth, but the cloth on top of him is just sitting on top of him, just sitting lightly across the top of his dead body. He's not moving. If he rolls off that cloth, if he's really alive, and he rolls off that cloth, which image is going to be darker? The one on which he was laying, i.e. his shoulders back all the way down to the feet, or would the image on the top be darker, covering the face and the chest and the hands and so on? What do you think?
Well, obviously the back, if he's laying on it.
Because you lay 180 pounds.
Yeah.
Well, get this. The image is equally dense on both locations. And these are just real strange scientific things. So 3D says what made that image went from the rib cage, the sides of the cheeks, the right leg, which is below. It went through space onto the cloth and put a mark on the cloth, even though it was not touching the cloth, and they were different centimeters away from the actual cloth. So 3D is real hard to understand. But the craziest one, and not everybody's sold on this one, but the one that's got a lot of attention in the last few years, is that underneath the man's chin, right across here, the image in the shroud, you can see very clearly what appear to be teeth and roots of the teeth. And it's not because somebody opened them up and there's a big cut there and you can see the teeth. He's not cut here. And one of the few places he's not cut. But he's not cut here, but you can see the teeth through the skin, and a few of them up on top. Now he's got a mustache just like I do, and he's got a goatee kind of beard kind of thing like this. But you can see the teeth through the hair and through the skin. Now here's the question: what created those teeth on the shroud? Now some people think it's an anomaly of the photographs. I understand that, and that's worth looking at. But some have said, some medical doctors, in fact, they showed a picture of this at Duke Medical School. One of the researchers was a Duke Medical School professor, and he showed it to one of his buddies in the medical school. And this guy was a dentist. He was a professor of dental surgery, and the fellow said that this was the best dental photo he'd ever seen. And I can explain why it was really good. But he was sure it was teeth through the bottom lip.
I want to show the audience an image of, there's a photo negative version of this image, which I think actually shows what you're talking about a little bit better. So we're going to go ahead and show you that. If you're listening to this on the podcast, on the audio version, please join us. Go to the YouTube version. You'll see what Gary's talking about. There's actually a photo negative image. It's like a black and white image. It's actually a positive, believe it or not, of the Shroud image, because we'll get to that in a second. But if I'm not mistaken, Gary, I think that the image on the Shroud you see with your naked eye is actually a photo negative. And if you take a photo negative of the photo negative, you get a positive. Is that right?
Correct. There's a right, left, and light darkness reversal. So if there's a blood stain on the cheek, that's dark, i.e. red. I mean, you would think. It shows up light on your photo. And if it's a light area, it shows up dark. And there's a 3-shaped blood stain right here on the forehead. It's going to reverse on each photograph. You get a backwards 3 on one of the photographs and a forwards 3 on the other photograph. People can see the 3-shaped blood stain, and on the other one, it's backwards. That's that left, right, light, darkness reversal.
Okay. So if I would have paused just there for a moment, if I could, what significance does it have that what significance do we find that the image seems to be a photo negative and there's this reversal? What significance does that have? Is that an anomaly worth thinking about?
Yeah, it is, but it's not one of the hardest ones to explain. Okay. I had a debate recently, it's on my website, with a fellow who was pro-Shroud and one of the pro-Shroud researchers. And then he studied the data and he became negative. And he and I debated. He's debated a number of the pro-Shroud guys, but he and I did. And I started out my middle section on 10 evidences that are very difficult to explain on the Shroud. If you had 10 evidences for the Shroud, I would make left-right reversal and light-darkness reversal. In fact, I think I did make them arguments 9 and 10. They're not to be compared to non-directionality, superficiality, 3D, and especially if those are teeth, it's like game, set, and match. If those are teeth, well, I'll tell you my personal experience. I said, those are teeth in the image. And he said, it looks just like an X-ray. These things look like the X-rays that I examined in the laboratory. Now, inasmuch as X-rays equal photographs of a certain thing, when you say, well, we're going to photograph your leg here and see if there's a break, an X-ray is a type of photograph. It's not the family photo, but it's still a photo. And the leading theory, it's disputed. It's going to be disputed by the critics. Obviously, they're not going to like this. But the leading experiments, including one that just occurred, the leading cause, the closest they can get, is to say all these things, i.e., non-directional, superficial, 3D, and you can see the teeth through the mouth. What the doctor was saying was, he said, you just said a minute ago, we're not sure if energy came down onto the cloth from above, if you're a Christian, or if it came out from the body. He said, I think you just answered the question. The energy's got to be coming out from the body, because if it's coming out of the body, it's dragging the images of the teeth out past the lips and imprinting them so you can see the teeth image. So the leading theory, according to researchers, is that the Shroud image is radiation from a dead body. Now, of course, now this is really getting to be an enigma, because if it looks like it could be Jesus, And there's anomalies here which say, as far as we know, only Jesus had all these things done to him. Here's another one. If the guy who's crucified is a criminal, why do you give him an honorable burial and treat him like a hero? Now, in the Gospels, we can understand it. They said buried with the wicked, but a righteous man with a tomb and so on. But that's another picture that looks like that. But if on top of all that, it's possible, I'm not trying to be bombastic, if it's possible that the shroud image is an X-ray, how in the world does a dead man give off an X-ray, if this medical doctor's right, emanating from inside his body, bringing the teeth image out on the outside of the body onto the cloth?
Does that have anything to do with also the way the fingers look too? Because some of the criticism has been that the fingers are too long; they're freakishly long on the image. Does that help explain some of that too?
Yeah. You've been doing some reading on this. In the old days, I mean decades ago, the critics would say, "Hey, those fingers are abnormally long. I mean, this artist wasn't a very good painter." Well, time out. There's no paint, dye, or powder on the shroud that can account for the image. So don't say painter if you're talking about data. But the image on the shroud looks like the fingers are too long. So in those days, if you can believe this, Abdu, people in those days said, "Oh, he looks like he's got Marfan syndrome," which the most famous person we know who had it was Abraham Lincoln. And abnormally long fingers and so on. Well, guess what? That's another indication of radiation. Because what you're seeing, I have slides when I do presentations, and a human hand skeleton is set next to the hand of the man in the shroud, and you can see the human hand, a skeleton, and you can see the finger bones go all the way up into the top of the hand. The man in the shroud, what looks like abnormally long fingers, are those same finger bones going up into the back of the hand. And the same thing with the teeth. It's another evidence, like the hands and teeth are data which point to this being very possibly, if not likely, an X-ray from a dead body. And think about this too. If it's Jesus, that's a huge if. I've got my qualms with the shroud. Some of the shroud researchers wonder why I'm not as positive as they are. There are some questions, but this is so interesting. If God did this, a big if, capital I, capital if God did this, and if it's an artifact of the resurrection, one book that came out real early even said we might be looking at a photograph of the resurrection of Jesus, in the sense that an X-ray is a photograph. This could be an X-ray of the resurrection. Well, if it is, imagine only God could do this. He's got to get the moment in the tomb where the man is still dead. He's in a state of rigor mortis, a separation of blood and serum. There's postmortem blood flow. The edges of the wound are such of what happens when a person's dead, what they'll find in a morgue. And this guy's dead. But the picture has to come when he is very dead, or what are you going to get, Abdul? You're going to get swoon theory. I knew it was a swoon theory. He's alive. Okay. No, he's got to be dead. But something's got to be happening to say, I don't know. I got a feeling if we wait another 100th of a second, that dead body is going to become a live body. So you have to get that millisecond of dead. Bingo, here comes some light-looking stuff, and he may not be dead for long. Now, this is getting kind of bombastic, and I think there are some good questions about the shroud that we have to answer too. But I mean, this is why a lot of people are paying attention and saying this could be the archaeological find of all time.
So that's what I want to do is, for the sake of time as well, and there's so much more, ladies and gentlemen, on this, I would direct you to GaryHabermas.com. And Gary's got some information on this as well. There's another website you should go to, by the way. I think it's called Shroud.com. It's a very detailed website on the shroud. And then, of course, check out Gary's YouTube page. Just type in Gary Habermas on YouTube, and you'll get a bunch of stuff. And probably, as Gary already said, some of his videos on the Shroud are there. So there's more detail than we necessarily have time to go into. But I do want to talk about two more things, if I could, because we've talked about the anomalies, and there's a bunch of other things too to think through, like some of the imagery on the Shroud, and we don't have time necessarily to talk about some of the iconography and some of the things that would suggest that it isn't. It actually predates the 13th century because of some of the images and icons and paintings of Jesus that would predate that time as well. So there's a lot there, and again, they could go to your website and they can go to your YouTube page to get some of that stuff. So I don't want to not mention it, but I also don't want to necessarily dwell on it for time's sake. There's two things I want to talk about. One really quick, aside from the image anomalies, which all by themselves are pretty intriguing. But one is the blood, and is the blood any significance to that? I mean, obviously you have a separation of serum and the fluid in the blood that's in there, and you'd have to know quite a bit about physiology and hematology if you're going to forge this thing in the 13th or 14th centuries. But there's bilirubin in the blood as well, which does indicate to us at least something. I don't know how significant you find that. What is your conclusion, or what are your observations about the blood itself?
Abdu, I'm maybe you can recall with me. What is the blood type that's called universal donor?
Oh boy,
I don't know. It might be, but you know what people?
I think it's AB or something like that. I can't remember I can't remember right now.
But you know what people say? They'll say, "Wow, if this is really Jesus, wouldn't it be really cool if his blood type were universal donor? Wouldn't that just be too much?" And it's not. But they've also DNA'd the blood. And someone goes, "Oh no, someone's going to bring Jesus back with the DNA." Here's the problem. I've heard medical doctors lecture on this point, and they say, "Look, tens of thousands of people have fingered the Shroud down through the centuries. And DNA is about the most volatile thing on earth. You are going to adjust it every time someone touches it. So yeah, we got a DNA on the Shroud, but it's useless because it's the DNA that, in a sense, everyone of the world, it's everybody's DNA. So no, we don't know what the DNA is and so on. But the man is dead. And as I said earlier, the carbon-14 thing has been exploded. So they don't know what date it is right now. There are some dates that go back to the first century, plus or minus, but they don't know what the dates are. They just know that the original date from 1988 is badly mistaken.
Can you real briefly just sort of give a really short history of the carbon dating and how that is, how that plays out?
I was lecturing at Christ Church. I'm sorry, not Christ Church. I was lecturing at one of the other Oxford colleges in 1988, and right in the middle of a lecture, the student said, "Oh, the Shroud dating is out. It's medieval." And we were having a day trip into London that day, and we got on the bus and went into town, and lo and behold, there were thousands of newspapers in piles, because everyone will hear this, get your news, the Shroud is a fake. And it was on the cover. And that was 88, and that kind of did it for a lot of people. About 2 years ago, there have been several comebacks. One researcher said, "Yeah, you're not going to get a date on the Shroud. Right, wrong, or indifferent, you're not going to get it because the Shroud's been in 2 fires at least, and fires change carbon contents of objects. So you're not going to get a date." Another one, a very famous one, argues and published in a peer-reviewed chemical journal, said that what were dated were these invisible weave threads that contaminated the cloth because it made the Shroud, instead of, and what they dated was not 100% the Shroud, it was maybe 60-40, and these medieval threads were in it. But the thing that's very, very influential is that a couple years ago, a team of people, including a couple statisticians, got freedom of information. Took them, I think, 2 years to get it, but they got the dates from the 3 laboratories in Arizona, Oxford, and Switzerland, and they got the dates that they, quote unquote, averaged to get medieval. Well, the dates are all over the place. they're all they're through the centuries, and these statisticians go, hey, let me tell you scientists something. You guys may be good, but you're not that good at math, and you don't know how to do stats. You don't average stats to get an average year. If you've got dates in the 600s and the 700s and more in the 10s and more in the 1200s, you don't average them. What you have are a bunch of anomalies, and the bottom line is we don't know the date. You can't just average them and think everybody agrees that it's that date you came up with. You guys screwed up the date thing. Well, what indicates that it was a very credible critique. If I remember this correctly, and I hope I'm saying it right, but one of the fellows whose name was on the carbon-14 that came out of Oxford, he was on the 88 carbon date. He is now the editor of a journal called Archaeochemistry. He's the editor of it, and he published their article. He thought it was worthy of publishing. He published the article, if I got that story right, his connection. But they published the article in an Oxford journal that actually went against the Oxford date of 1988. So they thought it was good enough evidence to go in. And right now it's pretty much been accepted. And the bottom line is we don't know how old the Shroud was, but it's not 1260 to 1350 or whatever the date was. That date is thrown out. Now more proposals are coming to find out if there's any way it can be dated, and if so, to what date.
Wow. So that was what you were talking about earlier in our episode here, where you were saying that there's some new information that sort of explodes the date. That's what you just talked about, right?
Right. Yes. It was very explosive because it hit the world with a bang. And when the word was, well, here, it's the Oxford Journal that published the 88 carbon-14, and it's an Oxford Journal that blew it up. So, tit for tat. I mean, that kind of said, this is balance, and it's operating both sides. And so 88 date is not boss right now.
Okay. Well, let me ask you one follow-up question, and then one more substantial question. Then I'm going to ask a sort of a wrap-up question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
The question is this: you mentioned that you have some misgivings on the Shroud and whether or not it's authentic. Can you just, for the sake of fairness, can you just give us a couple of those things that are still questions in your mind?
Yeah, and it's not so much that, oh wow, here's a really bad critique in reverse. It's more like this: science is inductive, and inductive arguments, the sciences and the social sciences, the latter being history, anthropology, psychology, and the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, and so on, they're all inductive. When you run a test, you live with the data you have, and you make a thesis based on what you have. We all know examples where things are exploded 20, 30, 40 years later. The Vinland map is a famous example. When the Vikings come to North America, and they upset dates, and we have to go back and you have to be open to science there being a better explanation than the one you had. And one issue with the Shroud is not that this is ever going to happen, but it's possible that somebody will come up with an experiment or something that could duplicate the image and get an image that has left-right reversal, like darkness reversal, non-directionality, superficiality, 3D, and showing teeth through the bottom lip. But the catch with this is that it's not there. We don't have. There have been a lot of people doing that, and they've submitted their results to the people who are, do the best scientific work, the main researchers, and so far nothing is out there that fakes the Shroud. So far, there's nothing like that, but you have to be aware that something could be forthcoming. But I don't have an argument in my mind which, well, Abdu, here's a stinky little argument that's going to blow this thing out of the water. I don't know anything of that caliber.
Okay. Well, that leads me to my final question then, is as a Christian, if you study this stuff, is the Shroud the kind of thing that is worthy of our attention and maybe even helps us to bolster some of the reasons why we think there's great other reasons? Obviously, if the Shroud never existed, we'd still have great reasons to believe in the resurrection. But does the Shroud help? Is it the kind of thing that you could say, yeah, this is something you could help? Or is it the kind of thing where even if you're a skeptic, it's worthy of our attention, and maybe even something that would be one more piece of evidence, not definitive necessarily, but a piece of evidence that could draw a reasonable juror to conclude that maybe, in fact, Jesus did die on a cross and rise from the dead. Would you say that could be evidence worth considering?
Yes, and I think the latter, because I think it belongs there. But a lot of your listeners know that I developed and I use this minimal facts argument for the resurrection, where I say I'll take the lowest common denominator of data, which high 90s percentile of skeptical New Testament scholars, atheists, agnostics, self-identified non-Christians will admit these data, and then I'll say, well, then you try to get around this data some other way other than resurrection. I think that minimal facts argument, I'm prejudiced, obviously, but I think that argument is stronger than the Shroud is. I think because we can nail it down more, and we know the variations because we can think of alternate theories, and they don't come close. But do I think the Shroud contributes? And yes, I'm doing a major work on the resurrection right now, and I would bring the Shroud in. Well, let's put it this way. On these facts that I use, I have major arguments for these facts and then secondary arguments or considerations that are not as strong. Let's put it this way. In a boxing match, you have knockout punches that end the fight, and you have cumulative body blows that can win the fight over long distance. I think the Shroud, I think there are a lot of knockout punches for Christianity. I think the Shroud might be a secondary argument, or maybe a weaker knockout punch if we can get some of these things sticking. So yes, I think it can be involved, but I think here's what needs to be done. I think we need to say, folks, I'm being humble about this. I could be wrong. I don't know for sure. I can't, I'm not going to link my life to the authenticity of the Shroud. But as we know right now, I think it's looking at another one of those many evidences that Christianity is true.
That's excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your testimony, Dr. Habermas. Friends, please do visit Gary's website, garyhabermas.com. Many of you will already know his work and are quite familiar with his work. 45 books that he's either authored himself or co-authored. Another massive work is on the way. Gary and I have talked about this several times, that his magnum opus on the resurrection, which contains these primary arguments, but also these secondary arguments, the knockouts and the body blows, is forthcoming. It's a massive amount of work. He deserves our support in that, because it's going to be a wonderful piece of work to not only bolster our faith, but to also challenge those of us who don't have a Christian faith and to want to look at these things with Gary's responsibility. And he's been a responsible scholar throughout his career, being honest as he can be with the data that is presented, not overstating the case, but not understating the case either. And I've always appreciated that about you, Gary. So thank you for your time. Also visit him on YouTube as well. And I urge you, if you're listening to this podcast only on the audio versions, whether it's Spotify or Apple or whatever else it might be, SoundCloud, please do go to the YouTube channel for this particular episode, because this is a lot of explanation, but the visuals really capture what Gary's talking about in terms of the x-rays and all that stuff. So having said all that, I want to thank you, Gary, for being on with us. You've been a tremendous help to us in understanding the Shroud, the controversies around the Shroud, and the current state of Shroud research. So I want to thank you very much for your time here with us.
Thank you, Abdu. Enjoyed being with you. And by the way, like I commented, you can tell you've done some research because you asked some pointed questions that go back to what people have already uncovered. So you love it when the people doing the interview know what they're talking about.
Yeah, well, thanks so much, Gary. I really appreciate that. Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that is the testimony for the day and the evidence for the day. Remember, it's real evidence we're looking at, and we're trying to find out authenticity of this real evidence. We have testimonial evidence, and the good news about the resurrection is that we have plenty of testimonial evidence, which is just as good as real evidence, and in fact, sometimes better. But we have this added artifact, which could be real evidence of something, as one expert has said, could be a photograph of the resurrection of Jesus. So I urge you to consider it. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Abdu Murray, and the defense rests.